A racist woman told Shaquille O'Neal he didn't belong on his own yacht. What started as a moment of ignorance turned into a global scandal, exposing the deep biases in elite spaces. As the world watched, her downfall was inevitable, but Shaq's response was something no one saw coming. Was this just another entitled millionaire facing consequences, or was it the beginning of a much bigger fight for real change? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The Miami sun shimmered over the marina, casting golden reflections on the still waters. Expensive yachts lined the docks, their sleek designs and polished exteriors gleaming under the afternoon sky. The scent of salt water mixed with the faint aroma of sunscreen and expensive cologne as elite guests moved about, sipping champagne and laughing in their small, exclusive circles. And then, Big Shaq arrived. Dressed in a laid-back yet stylish ensemble, a crisp white linen shirt, navy blue slacks, and designer loafers, Shaquille O'Neal stepped onto the dock with his signature calm confidence. He wasn't just a basketball legend. He wasn't just a billionaire businessman. He was a man who had built his success brick by brick, and today, he was here to relax. His yacht, Lucille's Legacy, named after his mother, wasn't just another luxury vessel. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for. A floating palace with state-of-the-art amenities, sleek white interiors, and an upper deck that offered an uninterrupted view of the endless ocean. Shaq inhaled deeply, taking in the peaceful energy of the water. This was home. He stepped aboard, greeted by his private crew, all of whom knew better than to make a fuss about their famous boss. They had been with him for years, and Shaq treated them not as workers, but as family. The yacht was already buzzing with guests. Business partners, old friends, and a few industry elites were enjoying the sun, engaging in quiet conversations, and savoring the luxury that Lucille's Legacy provided. And among them was Victoria Langley. Victoria Langley had never worked a day in her life. Born into old money, she carried herself with the type of entitlement that didn't need to be announced. It was just expected. With platinum blonde hair, icy blue eyes that rarely showed warmth, and a wardrobe worth more than some people's homes, she was the epitome of high society. She didn't just think she belonged everywhere. She believed others didn't. Draped in a sleek emerald green sundress, she was sipping a glass of wine on the upper deck when she first noticed Shaq walking around. Her gaze lingered on him longer than necessary, her lips curling into a slight frown. To her, he didn't fit. His presence disrupted the carefully curated aesthetic of wealth and exclusivity she had grown accustomed to. And in her world, when things didn't fit, they needed to be corrected. Shaq had barely settled into one of the oversized lounge chairs on the lower deck when he heard heels clicking sharply against the wooden planks. Victoria approached him with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her life. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying just the right amount of condescension. Shaq looked up, tilting his head slightly. "Yeah?" She gave him a practiced smile, the kind that was polite on the surface but dripping with arrogance underneath. "I think there's been a mix-up," she said. "This is a private event." Shaq raised an eyebrow, amused. "I know." Victoria's smile faltered, but she pressed on. "Well, the crew must not have informed you. This yacht is reserved for exclusively invited guests. High-profile figures, you understand." Shaq nodded slowly. "Oh, I understand." He took a sip of his drink, unfazed. Victoria blinked, expecting him to be more intimidated. Her expression hardened. "I'll be direct," she said, lowering her voice. "This isn't the place for you." Shaq leaned back in his chair, stretching his long legs. "Oh yeah?" he said, watching her carefully. "You must be staff," she continued, waving a manicured hand. "I don't know how you got so comfortable, but you shouldn't be lounging around. The guests don't like that." For a moment, Shaq just stared at her. Then he laughed. A deep, rich, unbothered laugh. Victoria's face turned red. "Did I say something funny?" she asked, her voice sharp. Shaq grinned. "A little bit, yeah." Victoria's patience snapped. "Look, I don't have time for this. Just do your job and get below deck." Shaq exhaled, setting his drink down. "Lady, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Victoria scoffed. I highly doubt that. She turned on her heel, marching toward the yacht's security team. Shaq watched with amusement. He could already see it coming. It took less than 2 minutes before 2 uniformed security personnel approached Shaq, looking incredibly uncomfortable. The first guard, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, cleared his throat. Sir, we've received a report that..." Shaq smirked. "Let me guess. Someone thinks I don't belong here?" The guard hesitated. "It's just a misunderstanding, but you still came over here to check, didn't you?" Shaq finished for him, his voice calm but sharp. The guards exchanged glances. Victoria, standing a few feet behind them, smirked triumphantly. Shaq shook his head, letting out a slow, amused sigh. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, tapped a few times, and then, without a word, turned the screen toward them. Silence. The guards stared at the ownership documents displayed on the screen, the official registration of Lucille's legacy. And there, clear as day, was Shaquille O'Neal's name. The first guard visibly gulped. The second guard looked at Victoria, whose smirk had vanished. Shaq gave her a slow, knowing smile. "Now," he said, voice smooth. "You were saying?" Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in her privileged, entitled life, she had nothing to say. The security guard stepped back immediately, suddenly more afraid of angering the real owner of the yacht. Shaq leaned forward slightly. "I could have told you from the beginning," he said, his voice lower now, more measured. "But I wanted to see how far you'd take it." Victoria's face burned with humiliation. Shaq picked up his drink again, took a slow sip. Then he looked at the guards. "I think we're done here." The first guard nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Apologies for the misunderstanding." They left in a hurry, leaving Victoria standing there, her world suddenly feeling much smaller. Shaq turned back to his view of the ocean, completely at ease. But he knew this wasn't over. Because people like Victoria Langley never accepted defeat quietly. And something in her icy blue eyes told him she wasn't going to let this go. The Miami sun was still high, casting golden streaks across the rolling waves, but the air on the yacht had shifted. The luxury of Lucille's legacy, its gleaming decks, its elegantly dressed guests, its polished atmosphere of exclusivity, felt tainted now, as if something unseen had cracked beneath the surface. And at the center of it all stood Victoria Langley, her face flushed with indignation, her entitled world shaken in a way she had never experienced before. For the first time, she had been publicly challenged, and she wasn't about to let that slide. Victoria had stormed away after her failed attempt to have Shaq removed, but she wasn't done. Not even close. She had spent her entire life in spaces like this, exclusive, pristine, carefully curated, and she had always been the one who dictated the rules. Yet now, the man she had assumed was staff, the man she had tried to dismiss like an inconvenience, was still here, relaxed, unbothered, and worst of all, completely in control. The fact that he owned the yacht didn't sit right with her, so she did what people like her always did when they were cornered. She got louder. She turned toward the other guests, the elite figures mingling with drinks in hand, their conversations hushed as they watched the spectacle unfold. "Are we really not going to talk about this?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the sea breeze. Some guests looked away. Others exchanged awkward glances. Victoria scoffed. "So we're just going to pretend this isn't completely absurd?" Shaq, still seated comfortably in his lounge chair, barely reacted. He simply lifted his glass to his lips, taking a slow sip, as if she weren't even worth acknowledging. That made her angrier. "This is ridiculous," she continued, stepping forward, her designer heels clacking against the deck like a warning shot. "A luxury yacht is supposed to represent class, status, wealth, the highest caliber of society." Shaq smirked, shaking his head slightly. "That's so?" "Yes," she snapped. "And let's be honest, we all know he doesn't belong here." A ripple of unease spread through the gathering. The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that Victoria had just crossed a line. Others, the ones who had been nodding along with her earlier, hesitated now, suddenly unsure if they wanted to be on the wrong side of whatever was about to happen next. The yacht's crew, dressed in crisp white uniforms, had been quietly observing the entire exchange. Most of them knew Shaq was the owner, but Victoria's presence, her name, her family's wealth, her influence, held weight in these circles. For a second, some of them hesitated. Would they correct her? Would they risk offending a woman whose social power could make or break careers? The captain, an older man with years of experience dealing with the privileged elite, looked at Shaq carefully, waiting for a cue. Shaq noticed. He saw the hesitation, the way power, real or perceived, dictated who was believed, who was defended, and who was dismissed. He had seen it his whole life. And that's when he made a decision. Shaq finally set his drink down, stretching slightly, his massive frame impossible to ignore. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket. The crowd watched as he pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward them. The screen displayed an official ownership document, Lucille's legacy. Registered owner, Shaquille O'Neal. The reaction was immediate. A heavy, stifling silence fell over the deck. Victoria blinked, then blinked again. Somewhere in the back, someone coughed, the sound awkward and misplaced in the thick tension. A man who had been nodding along with Victoria earlier suddenly found something very interesting in his drink and turned away. One of the crew members let out an audible breath of relief, grateful that they hadn't stepped in on the wrong side. And Victoria? She froze. For the first time since this began, she had no words. Shaq let the silence stretch, let it settle into the bones of every single person who had assumed he didn't belong here. Then, slowly, he looked back at Victoria and smiled. It wasn't a gloating smile. It wasn't angry or smug. It was the smile of a man who had seen this story play out 1,000 times before. A man who wasn't surprised, not by her assumptions, not by the hesitation of others, and not by the way her world was now crashing down around her. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Now," he said, voice as smooth as ever. "What was that you were saying about class, status, and wealth?" A few guests chuckled nervously, not because the moment was funny, but because the tension needed somewhere to go. Victoria's face turned red. Shaq could see it happening in real time, the realization creeping across Victoria's face. She had lost, completely, publicly. And for someone like Victoria Langley, that was worse than any personal insult. For a fleeting second, she looked like she was about to apologize. Her lips parted, her shoulders tensed. Then, just as quickly, she recoiled, her pride overpowering her shame. She straightened her back, lifted her chin. "Well," she said, voice clipped, "I suppose there's been a misunderstanding." Shaq's smile didn't fade. "Yeah. Suppose there has." Victoria turned sharply, walking away without another word, her heels clacking in frustration. A few guests followed her, either embarrassed on her behalf or simply unwilling to acknowledge what had just happened. But some stayed. Some, for the first time, looked at Shaq with a different kind of respect. Because in less than 5 minutes, without raising his voice, without needing to prove a thing, he had just dismantled the entire foundation of their quiet, inherited prejudices. Shaq leaned back into his chair again, picking up his drink. One of the yacht's crew members, the same ones who had hesitated earlier, stepped forward nervously. "Mr. O'Neal," he said carefully, "can I get you anything else?" Shaq looked up at him, noted the change, and with an easy grin he replied, "Nah, man. I got everything I need." The sun continued to shine. The waves continued to roll. But the air on Lucille's legacy had changed, because Victoria Langley might have walked away. But Shaq's presence? That wasn't going anywhere. Victoria Langley was many things, but a woman who admitted she was wrong? That wasn't one of them. Even as she stood there, her face burning with humiliation, the weight of 100 judgmental stares pressing down on her, she refused to back down. Because in Victoria's world, power didn't come from being right, it came from refusing to lose. And right now, she was losing. The sound of the waves lapping against the yacht was the only thing filling the silence left in the wake of Shaq's casual, devastating revelation. He owned the yacht. Not a guest, not a borrower, not some lucky outsider who had stumbled into luxury by accident. He was the man in charge, and Victoria hated it. Her carefully constructed reality, a world where people like her set the rules, where exclusivity meant control, was slipping. So, instead of accepting the truth, she did what people like her always did when cornered. She rewrote the narrative. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed, waving a dismissive hand at Shaq, as if the very idea of him owning something of this magnitude was too absurd to entertain. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing where this was going. "It's obviously not his," Victoria continued, recovering her confidence, her voice sharpening. "Maybe he borrowed it, or won it, or some investor friend let him use it for the day." Shaq let out a low, amused chuckle, shaking his head. Victoria's arrogance was almost impressive. Her ability to deny reality in real time. Somewhere in the back, a guest pulled out their phone, discreetly recording. Because they recognized this moment for what it was. Not just a rich woman having a meltdown, but privilege refusing to acknowledge its limits. Most of the guests knew Shaq. They had seen him on TV, watched him dominate the court, read about his business ventures in Forbes. But still, Victoria had influence. Her last name, her family connections, the unspoken power that came with old money. It made people hesitate. Because in these circles, calling out someone like her came with risks. So they did what the privileged do when witnessing injustice. They stayed silent. Some of them looked down at their drinks, pretending to be distracted. Some gave awkward shrugs, as if this situation wasn't their business. And a few nodded along with Victoria, unwilling to challenge the lie she was desperately trying to spin. Victoria saw the hesitation, and it emboldened her. "These kinds of misunderstandings happen all the time," she said smoothly, as if she were doing everyone a favor by correcting the situation. She turned to the yacht's crew. "Now, are we really going to take his word for it?" she asked, her tone patronizing. "Surely, there's someone with actual authority we can—" Shaq cut her off with a simple action. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Shaq's voice was calm, almost too casual. "Yeah," he said into the phone, leaning back in his chair. "I need a favor." A pause. "Nah, nothing crazy. Just a little mix-up down at the marina." Victoria stiffened. This wasn't the response she had expected. She had been prepared for an argument, a debate, a scene where she could play the victim. But this was something else. He wasn't defending himself. He was handling it. Which meant he had power too. Real power. The kind that didn't need to be flaunted. The kind that made things happen with a single call. A sinking feeling settled in her chest, but she wasn't ready to surrender just yet. It took less than 10 minutes before a marina official arrived on the yacht. A man in a tailored navy suit, with the kind of stiff posture that suggested he spent his days around billionaires and knew exactly how to address them. The second he stepped on board, his eyes found Shaq, and his entire demeanor changed. He hurried forward, face paling as he realized who was in front of him. "Mr. O'Neal," he greeted, his voice suddenly respectful, deferential. "I wasn't aware you had an issue." Shaq didn't stand, didn't move. He simply gestured loosely toward Victoria. "Apparently, there's been some confusion," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. The official's gaze flickered toward Victoria, and his expression tightened. He knew who she was too. But unlike Shaq, her name didn't inspire deference. It inspired damage control. For the first time, Victoria felt it slipping away. Her grip on the conversation, the unspoken loyalty of the guests, her control over the narrative. The official cleared his throat. "Ms. Langley," he said carefully, his voice now purely professional. "Mr. O'Neal is the registered owner of this yacht. There is no mistake here." Victoria went still. Her carefully crafted world, the one where her wealth, her name, her privilege made her untouchable, was now crumbling in real time. She opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to say. Because the moment the official acknowledged Shaq's authority, she was no longer the most powerful person in the room. Shaq let the silence drag on, watching as realization sank in. Then, finally, he leaned forward slightly. "I could have told you that from the beginning," he said, his voice casual but cutting. Victoria flinched. Shaq picked up his drink again, taking a slow sip. "I just wanted to see how far you'd take it." A few guests exhaled sharply, the kind of breath people take when witnessing the end of something that should have never started. Victoria's hands curled into fists, her carefully manicured nails digging into her palm. She was trapped now, and she knew it. She inhaled sharply, forcing one last attempt at control. "Well," she said stiffly, lifting her chin, desperate to salvage some dignity. "I suppose there was a misunderstanding." Shaq smiled. "Yeah, suppose there was." And just like that, she turned and walked away. Not storming, not causing a scene, just walking away, shoulders stiff, back straight, the weight of public failure pressing down on her. Because in these circles, losing quietly was the only way to survive. The moment she left, the energy shifted. A few guests visibly relaxed, realizing that the weight of privilege's worst representative had been removed. One of the yacht's crew members, who had hesitated earlier, stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. O'Neal," he said, "can I get you anything?" Shaq looked at him, saw the difference, the respect. And with an easy grin, he replied, "Nah, man. I got everything I need." Because unlike Victoria Langley, who had to pretend she belonged, Shaq already knew he did. Victoria Langley had spent her entire life controlling the narrative. She grew up in a world where power wasn't just about money. It was about perception, reputation, influence. She was used to whisper networks smoothing over her mistakes, to connections ensuring her name stayed pristine. But there was one thing money and privilege couldn't control: the internet. And right now, the internet had turned its full attention to her. It started with one video, a 32-second clip, shaky but clear, taken from the upper deck of Lucille's Legacy. In it, Victoria's voice rang out sharply, condescending, entitled, dripping with arrogance. A luxury yacht is supposed to represent class, status, and wealth. And let's be honest, we all know he doesn't belong here. The camera panned to Shaquille O'Neal, leaning back in his chair, calm, unfazed, completely in control. Then the final moment, Shaq's slow smirk. The phone, the ownership documents. Victoria's stunned silence. The perfect ending to the perfect downfall. At first it was just a few hundred retweets, a couple of viral posts. Then within hours it exploded. TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. Every platform was flooded with the video. The captions varied, but the message was the same. Racist socialite tries to kick Shaq off his own yacht, gets humbled in real time. When privilege meets reality, this is wild. This lady really thought Shaq was staff. The audacity. The comments were ruthless. She really tried to Karen Shaquille O'Neal. Girl, be serious. The way he just sat there and let her embarrass herself is elite-level patience. Rich people racism is so casual it's scary. Within hours, meme culture took over. Side-by-side edits of Victoria's reaction and Shaq's calm smirk flooded Twitter. GIFs of her freezing mid-sentence became a trending joke. Someone even auto-tuned her meltdown into a remix titled "Men Like You," which racked up millions of views overnight. But the biggest moment came when celebrities started weighing in. A well-known rapper tweeted, "Ain't no way someone tried to Karen Shaq, the audacity." A legendary actress posted, "This is why we keep saying privilege runs deep. Y'all really don't see us as belonging, no matter how rich we are." NBA stars, Hollywood actors, and influencers all chimed in. Athletes shared their own experiences of being mistaken for security, for drivers, for assistants, even in spaces they owned. Activists turned the video into a case study on racism in elite spaces, using it as proof that money doesn't erase bias. And then, the news cycle caught on. The next morning, the incident was all over major media networks: CNN, MSNB, Good Morning America, The View. Every show had the same discussion. How could a man as famous and successful as Shaquille O'Neal still be treated like he didn't belong? A political analyst on one network sighed. If it can happen to Shaq, it can happen to anyone. That's the real conversation here. A black entrepreneur on another panel shook his head. You don't out-earn racism. You don't out-fame it. You just experience it differently. The clip of Victoria's meltdown played on a loop, her words dissected, her arrogance turned into a cultural moment. And Victoria? She was nowhere to be found. Shaq's phone had been blowing up since the moment the video went viral. His PR team had called 6 times before noon. Shaq, his publicist begged over voicemail, we need a statement. Everyone's waiting to hear what you have to say. But Shaq, he wasn't interested in feeding the fire. Because this wasn't new to him. He had lived it before. This wasn't just about Victoria Langley making a fool of herself. This was about a system. A system that still questioned his presence, no matter how many millions he made, no matter how many awards he won. So instead of reacting, he let the world talk. And he focused on what came next. While Shaq stayed silent, Victoria's world was collapsing. She had assumed the video would fade away in a day or two. She was wrong. Her inbox was flooded with emails from PR firms, offering to help her rebrand and rebuild. Her phone rang constantly, but no one was calling to support her. Instead, her business partners were cutting ties. Her inbox pinged again. Subject: termination of partnership, Langley Real Estate. Another deal, gone. By noon, 2 luxury brands she had long been associated with released public statements distancing themselves from her. We stand against all forms of discrimination and will not be working with Ms. Langley moving forward. Victoria stared at her screen, her stomach twisting. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was Victoria Langley. A name that mattered. A name that protected her from consequences. But now, her name was the problem. It wasn't until her own friends started ghosting her that she realized just how bad it was. She sent a text to an old friend from the country club. Victoria. This is insane. The media is twisting everything. No response. She tried another. Victoria. You know me. You know I'm not racist. Silence. She sent a third. Victoria. I need to fix this. Any ideas? Finally, a response. Lauren. Best thing you can do? Disappear. Victoria stared at the screen, her hands trembling. This wasn't just bad press. This was exile. For the first time in her life, money and power weren't enough to save her. And now, she had one last option. She had to reach out to the only person who could possibly change the conversation, Shaquille O'Neal. That night, as Miami glittered under the city lights, Victoria sat in her penthouse, gripping her phone. She hesitated for a long time. Then finally, she called Shaq. The line rang, and rang, and rang, until it went to voicemail. She swallowed hard. Then, with shaking hands, she left a message. Shaquille, I need to talk. Please, just give me a chance. She hung up, staring at the phone, waiting, hoping. But the screen stayed dark. Because this time, she wasn't the one in control. Victoria Langley had never been hated before. She had been envied, admired, even quietly resented. But never this. Never the public outrage, the social exile, the sudden disappearance of people who once clung to her name like it meant something. And she couldn't handle it. For the first time in her privileged, protected life, she was the one on the outside looking in. And that was unacceptable. Victoria sat in her penthouse, surrounded by her crisis team, a group of PR strategists, legal advisors, and branding experts, all with tight expressions and even tighter deadlines. They had one job: fix this. Victoria, draped in a silk robe, hair wrapped in a towel, scrolled through her phone, jaw clenched as she read the latest headlines. Victoria Langley, the yacht Karen who tried to check a billionaire. Racism, wealth, and the illusion of power. Shaq's viral moment exposes deep truths. Victoria Langley dropped by another luxury brand. Is this the end of her social reign? Her fingers tightened around the phone. This is insane, she hissed. It's just a misunderstanding. A PR manager, a woman in a perfectly pressed blazer, inhaled sharply. Victoria, the internet doesn't see it that way. Well, the internet is full of idiots, Victoria snapped. I'm not racist. The room stiffened, because everyone in it knew. What Victoria believed about herself didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was what the world believed. A man from the PR team leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Listen, this isn't going away," he said carefully. "We need to control the message. If we release a statement, we can shift the narrative." Victoria folded her arms. What kind of statement? Hours later, a text post appeared on Victoria's social media. White background, black serif font. Simple, elegant, but not genuine. The caption read, "To those I may have offended, I'd like to say," click. Millions tapped in, and the world read her so-called apology. I want to take a moment to address the situation that has unfolded over the past few days. First and foremost, I am deeply sorry if my words or actions were misinterpreted in any way. It was never my intention to offend or make anyone feel unwelcome. I was simply looking out for the integrity of the yacht's exclusivity. With heightened security concerns in today's world, I reacted in what I thought was a responsible way. Unfortunately, it was taken out of context. To Mr. O'Neal, I extend my sincerest apologies for any misunderstanding. I have the utmost respect for him and his contributions to the world of sports and business. I hope we can all learn from this and move forward with kindness. The moment the statement dropped, the comment sections exploded. Did she just say misinterpreted? Taken out of context. Girl, the video is right there. Classic non-apology. Blame everyone else, never yourself. Looking out for exclusivity? Yeah, that's code for racism. Within minutes, #apology not accepted was trending. Memes flooded the internet. Screenshots of her post were circulating with red-marked annotations, pointing out every insincere phrase, every deflection, every subtle refusal to take accountability. A popular late-night show host even mocked it on air. You know an apology is bad when it starts with "if my words were misinterpreted." That's like saying, "I'm sorry you got mad at me for slapping you." Even the people who normally defended her, the upper-class elite who prided themselves on their exclusivity, began to distance themselves. Because if there's one thing the rich hate more than a scandal, it's a scandal that refuses to die. Victoria Langley wasn't a protected name anymore. She was a liability. And while her world was burning down Shaq, he was receiving messages of a different kind. Shaq had kept his silence. He hadn't posted about the video, hadn't spoken about Victoria, hadn't engaged in the online frenzy. But that didn't stop the world from reaching out to him. His DMs were overflowing, not just with support, but with stories, from fans, from strangers, from people who had experienced exactly what he had experienced on that yacht. A college student wrote, "I had a professor assume I was a janitor because I was wearing a hoodie. This happens all the time, and people like Victoria just prove it." A black businessman messaged, "I've been mistaken for the valet at my own office building. You handled that situation better than I ever could have." A former pro athlete shared, "People don't get it. You can have all the money in the world, all the success, and they still look at you like you don't belong." Hundreds of messages, thousands of stories. Shaq sat in his Miami hotel room, phone in his hand, scrolling through them all. And something deep inside him shifted. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been made to feel like an outsider in their own world. Victoria's racism wasn't unique. It was just louder than usual. And now, the world had seen it for what it was. His team wanted him to respond, to issue his own statement, to capitalize on the moment, to call out Victoria directly, and use his voice to shut her down for good. But Shaq didn't care about winning the internet. He wasn't interested in destroying her. What he did care about was the conversation this had started. The bigger issue, the real fight. How people, black men in particular, could be millionaires, legends, business moguls, and still be treated like they didn't belong. This wasn't just about a private yacht. It was about every boardroom, every gated community, every high-end event where people like him were still second-guessed. He rubbed his temple, letting out a slow breath. Then, finally, he picked up his phone and called the one person he knew would give him the realest answer. His mother. She picked up after the first ring. "Shaquille. Ma, you sound tired." Shaq let out a small chuckle. "I am." Lucille sighed. "This about that video?" You saw it? Boy, the whole country saw it. I bet even your grandma in heaven saw it. Shaq leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. I don't know what to do, Ma. Lucille was quiet for a moment. Then, you already know what to do. Shaq frowned. I do? You always knew. You just needed to hear it. Shaq exhaled. She was right. He knew exactly what he had to do, and it wasn't about Victoria Montrose at all. Victoria Langley had always believed in one simple rule. No matter what happened, no matter how bad a scandal got, there was always a way back. Money could fix things. Connections could smooth things over. A well-timed PR move could erase any mistake. But this was different. Because this time, it wasn't just one bad moment on a yacht. This time, the world had started looking deeper. And what they found was worse than anyone expected. It started with the viral video. But it didn't end there. Because once the internet turned against you, people started digging. And when people started digging, they found things. Old interviews, deleted social media posts, stories buried under NDAs and hush money. And Victoria, she had a lot to hide. Within days, Twitter threads began circulating, exposing a pattern of racism and elitism that stretched back years. Someone posted a clip from a 2018 gala where Victoria had been caught on a hot mic saying, "Ugh, why do they always have to invite diversity hires to these events?" Another video from a 2019 private yacht party surfaced, where Victoria had joked about mistaking a black billionaire for a waiter and laughed about it. Screenshots of leaked emails showed her rejecting business pitches from minority-owned companies, calling them too urban for her brand. And then, the employees started speaking up. At first, no one wanted to be the first one to talk. Victoria was powerful, connected, dangerous. But once one voice broke the silence, others followed. Madeline Carter, a former executive assistant at Langley Enterprises, was the first to go public. Her tweet exploded overnight. I worked for Victoria Langley for 5 years. I saw it all, the racism, the mistreatment, the way she treated her black and brown employees like they were beneath her. If the world thinks what she did to Shaq was bad, they haven't even scratched the surface. The internet demanded receipts, and Madeline delivered. She did a full interview, sharing stories of how Victoria refused to promote black employees, how she joked that hiring more minorities was just performative nonsense. More employees joined in, sharing their own horror stories. A black marketing manager who was constantly talked over in meetings and later replaced by a white colleague with half the experience. A Latina housekeeper who was verbally abused and forced to work unpaid overtime while Victoria's white staff got raises. A driver who was fired after refusing to take the staff entrance at an elite event. Story after story. Testimony after testimony. By the time the 5th former employee spoke out, it was clear. Victoria Langley had spent her entire career stepping on people who didn't look like her. And now, the world finally knew. The first brand to cut ties was Langley Real Estate's biggest investor. They released a cold, detached statement the morning after the allegations went viral. We do not tolerate discrimination in any form. Effective immediately, we are ending all business relations with Ms. Langley. One by one, the dominoes fell. A high-end fashion label announced they were pulling her from their next campaign. A luxury champagne brand revoked their sponsorship. Even the exclusive members-only club she had belonged to for years quietly revoked her membership. Because in the world of the ultra-rich, bad press is bad business. And Victoria Langley had just become radioactive. Victoria had always surrounded herself with powerful people, CEOs, socialites, politicians, people whose wealth had protected them from scandal before. But as the backlash grew, so did the distance. The same friends who had once laughed at her jokes, who had stood by her side at exclusive galas and yacht parties, stopped answering her calls. They didn't want to be associated with her downfall. They ghosted her, one by one, until suddenly, she was alone. And Shaq? Shaq was focused on something else entirely. While the media was ripping Victoria apart, Shaq stayed silent. Not because he didn't care, but because he was looking forward, not backward. Victoria's downfall wasn't the victory. The real victory was in what came next. Shaq had spent his entire life fighting to prove that black men belonged in elite spaces. Now, he wanted to make sure the next generation didn't have to. Instead of giving interviews about Victoria, Shaq announced a new initiative, a multi-million-dollar fund designed to support black and minority entrepreneurs in business, tech, and real estate. A program that would open doors in industries where people like Victoria had worked so hard to keep them shut. It wasn't about revenge. It was about legacy. And while Victoria was fighting to hold on to power, Shaq was passing it forward. With nowhere left to turn, Victoria did the one thing she had never done before. She asked for help. And the only person who could save her was the same man she had humiliated on that yacht. Late one night, as Miami's skyline glowed against the water, Victoria sat in her penthouse, staring at her phone. Then, with a deep breath, she dialed Shaq's number. Then, voicemail. She swallowed hard, then left a message. Shaquille, I know I don't deserve your time, but please, I need to talk. She hesitated, then added, softer than she had ever spoken before. I don't know how to fix this. Click. The call ended, and Victoria sat there, waiting, hoping, desperate for a response. But the screen stayed dark, because for the first time in her privileged life, she wasn't the one in control. Shaquille O'Neal had never been one for petty battles. He had spent his life rising above, on the court, in business, and in the world. He knew that real power wasn't about tearing people down, it was about lifting others up. So while the internet was tearing Victoria Langley apart, Shaq wasn't focused on her. He was focused on something bigger. Because this wasn't just about one woman's ignorance. This was about a system that still, in 2024, questioned whether men like him truly belonged. And that was the real fight. For days, news anchors, social media influencers, and late-night hosts had all been waiting for Shaq to respond. Would he call Victoria out? Would he sue? Would he go on TV and tell the world what he really thought? Instead, on a quiet Sunday morning, Shaq posted a video. No fancy background. No PR-approved speech. No hashtags. Just him, sitting in a leather chair, looking directly into the camera. And when he spoke, the world listened. I've been rich. I've been famous. I've been in rooms most people will never step foot in. But before all of that, I was just a kid. A black kid who heard the same thing over and over again. You don't belong here. I heard it when I was 6 feet tall at 14, and people told me I'd never be more than a basketball player. I heard it when I went to business meetings, and executives assumed I was just a face for a brand, not the owner. I heard it when I walked into a high-end dealership, and the salesman told me I probably couldn't afford what was on the lot. And last week, I heard it again, on a yacht with my own name on it. See, here's the truth. Money doesn't erase prejudice. Success doesn't erase racism. Respect doesn't erase bias. It just makes it quieter. It gets disguised as concern. It gets wrapped up in words like exclusivity. It hides behind polite smiles and security checks. But make no mistake, it's still there. And I'm not mad about what happened on that yacht. I'm just tired. Tired of proving I belong. Tired of watching young black men work twice as hard, only to be questioned twice as much. So instead of focusing on one person's ignorance, I'm choosing to focus on the solution. That's why today, I'm announcing something bigger. Something that goes beyond me. Something that opens doors so that the next generation never has to knock twice. Today I'm launching the Belonging Initiative, a program dedicated to increasing access for underrepresented communities and industries that have shut them out for too long. We're starting with yachting, where less than 2% of yacht owners and executives are black. We're moving into aviation, because wealth should never determine who gets to fly private and who gets questioned at the gate. We're investing in finance, in tech, in spaces that have always been gated, guarded, and protected from people like me. Because the problem was never that we didn't belong. The problem was that some people were never taught to see us as equals. And it's time the world caught up. Within minutes, the video had millions of views. Within hours, it was everywhere. Major news outlets aired it in full, calling it one of the most powerful statements on race and privilege in years. Shaq had shifted the conversation. It was no longer about Victoria Langley's downfall. It was about real change. Celebrities reposted it. Business leaders pledged support. Athletes and musicians shared their own stories of being questioned, underestimated, treated as if they were out of place, even in spaces they had earned. One NBA legend commented, "This isn't just about yachts. This is about every meeting, every dinner, every conversation where we're seen as guests instead of owners." A black billionaire investor tweeted, "We've been fighting to get a seat at the table. Shaq is saying, forget the table. Let's build our own, and I'm here for it." The Belonging Initiative website crashed within an hour, flooded with messages from young entrepreneurs, pilots, yacht captains, finance executives, all looking for a way in. The conversation had shifted. Shaq wasn't just reacting, he was leading. And Victoria Langley? She was nowhere to be found. While Shaq's video united people, Victoria was losing everything. Her brand deals were dead, her business was tanking. Her inner circle had abandoned her. Even her own family wasn't standing by her. Because in elite spaces, the only real sin isn't ignorance. It's bad press. And Victoria Langley was now a liability. She had tried to ride out the scandal. She had assumed that it would blow over. But every day, it got worse. The same people who had laughed at her jokes, who had nodded along in agreement when she made backhanded comments about keeping spaces exclusive, were suddenly silent. And for the first time, Victoria felt what it was like to be truly alone. Late one night, as Victoria sat in her penthouse, staring at the city lights, she did something she never thought she'd have to do. She picked up her phone and called Shaq. Voicemail. She hesitated, her throat dry, her pride clashing with her desperation. Then finally she spoke. "Shaquille, I know I don't deserve your time, but please just give me a chance." She swallowed. "I don't know how to fix this." Click. The call ended. And for the first time in her privileged life, Victoria Langley wasn't the one in control. Now the question was, would Shaq answer? Shaq didn't owe Victoria Langley anything. Not a meeting, not a conversation, not his time. But he still agreed. Not for revenge. Not for closure. For answers. Because he needed to hear it. From her directly. He needed to understand why, after everything he had built, everything he had achieved, there were still people like Victoria who saw him as less. And more importantly, did she even know why she thought that way? The meeting was arranged at a quiet, upscale hotel lounge in Miami. No cameras, no reporters, no publicists, just two people in the weight of everything that had happened. Victoria arrived first. Her presence wasn't as commanding as before. The designer outfit was still there, but the confidence, that was gone. She sat at a table by the window, her hands clasped tightly, her nails, usually perfect, showing signs of nervous picking. She wasn't used to being on the other side of power, and when Shaq walked in, she felt it immediately. His presence was effortless. No need for flash, no need for theatrics. Just a man who knew exactly who he was. Victoria didn't. Not anymore. Shaq sat down across from her, resting his massive hands on the table. For a moment, neither spoke. The tension sat between them, thick, waiting. Then Victoria exhaled sharply. "I want to start by saying..." Shaq held up a hand. "No PR speech," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't come here for that." Victoria's lips pressed together. "Then why did you come?" she asked. Shaq leaned forward slightly. "Because I want to know one thing," he said. His deep voice was measured, steady, but there was an edge to it. One that told her there was no running from this. Victoria swallowed. "Okay." Shaq locked eyes with her. "Why did you really think I didn't belong?" Victoria's breath hitched, as if she had been punched by the question. For the first time, she had to say it out loud. Not in whispers, not in private jokes, not with the safety of like-minded people around her. Just her. Alone. And she wasn't ready. "I don't know," she said quickly. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, you do." Victoria looked away, gripping the edge of the table. "I was confused." She tried again. "I thought maybe you were..." Shaq tilted his head. A worker? Security? Victoria winced. Shaq gave a humorless chuckle. You really want me to believe you just made a mistake? Victoria's shoulders tensed. I wasn't trying to be racist, she blurted. Shaq nodded slowly. Ah, the classic defense. Victoria's face burned. You just what? Shaq pressed. Saw a black man on a yacht and assumed he wasn't the owner? Victoria's jaw clenched. I was raised in a world where people like you weren't in places like that, she muttered. Shaq's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air. There it was. The truth. Victoria inhaled sharply, as if she wanted to snatch the words back, but it was too late. Shaq leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. People like me, he repeated. Victoria looked small now, trapped in the weight of her own admission. She started, but Shaq held up a hand. Nah, let's sit with that for a second, he said. Victoria's fingers tightened around her glass. This was the first time she was being forced to face it. Not excuse it, not defend it, not explain it away, just face it. For the first time, Victoria didn't fight back. She exhaled sharply, looking down at her hands. My father taught me that wealth had rules, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Shaq watched her carefully. Rules like what? She swallowed hard. That certain spaces were meant for certain people. A bitter laugh escaped Shaq's lips. Meant for certain people, he repeated. So what, Victoria? You thought I broke the rules? Victoria flinched. She had never had to think about it before. Never had to explain the things she had been conditioned to believe. But now, she couldn't run from it. I was wrong, she said, forcing herself to say it. I was taught that wealth looked a certain way, and that people who didn't look like me didn't belong. She inhaled sharply. I never questioned it, until now. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, not angry, just heavy. Shaq studied her for a long moment. Then finally he spoke. You know what the difference between us is, Victoria? He asked. Victoria shook her head slowly. Shaq exhaled, leaning forward slightly. I had to fight for my seat at the table. You were just given yours. Victoria swallowed hard. And here's the thing, Shaq continued. I don't care if people like you lose your power. Victoria's breath hitched. Shaq leaned in closer, his voice lower now. I care about making sure people like me don't have to prove they belong anymore. Victoria nodded slowly, her throat tight. She had never felt this exposed before. This wasn't just about an apology. This was about unlearning everything she had ever been taught about the world. And Shaq, he could see it on her face. Maybe it was real. Maybe it wasn't. But in the end, that wasn't his responsibility. That was hers. Shaq stood up, adjusting his watch. Victoria looked up at him. So what now? Shaq gave a small shrug. That's up to you. Victoria bit her lip, hesitation flashing across her face. She wanted to ask more, to understand more. But Shaq had already given her enough. Now, it was on her. As he walked away, Victoria was left sitting alone, staring at the empty space across from her. And the audience? They were left wondering. Was she truly changing? Or just trying to save herself? The world had moved on. The viral video, the outrage, the headlines calling Victoria Langley the Yacht Karen, all of it had faded into the next cycle of scandals and breaking news. For most people, it was just another internet moment. But for Shaq, it was never about Victoria. She had been a symptom, not the cause. And while the media had torn her apart, Shaq had stayed focused on the bigger picture. His mission to create lasting change in spaces where people like him had always been questioned. Shaq sat in his office, reviewing a stack of reports from his new initiative, the Belonging Project. It had grown faster than even he expected. Over 200 scholarships for minority students in aviation, yachting, and finance. Corporate partnerships forming to hire underrepresented talent. A new mentorship program connecting young Black entrepreneurs with investors. Shaq didn't just open doors, he was knocking down walls. And the best part? This was just the beginning. Then, his phone buzzed with a new email. He glanced at the sender, Victoria Langley. For a long moment, he just stared at it. He opened the email. Subject: an invitation and a step forward, Shaquille. I know I'm the last person you expected to hear from, but after our conversation, I realized I had two choices: walk away from my mistakes or do something about them. I chose the second. For the past few months, I've been working with the Bridges Project, an anti-racism organization focused on breaking down systemic bias in elite spaces. We're hosting an event next month in New York, and I'd like you to be our keynote speaker. Not as a favor, not as an apology, but because you've taught me more than I was ever willing to learn before. I hope you'll consider it. Shaq sat back, exhaling slowly. He hadn't expected this. Could people like Victoria really change? Or was this just another attempt to clean up her image? Shaq had seen it before. Rich people who got caught, lost everything, and suddenly found the light. Was Victoria one of them? Or was she actually trying to do the work? He thought back to their conversation, the moment she had finally admitted the truth. I was raised in a world where people like you weren't in places like that. Was that growth? Or just survival? Shaq didn't have the answer, but maybe that wasn't the point. A month later, Shaq walked into a packed auditorium in New York. The event was a gathering of business leaders, activists, and policymakers working to dismantle bias in elite industries. And in the front row, Victoria Langley. Not on stage, not at the center of attention, just watching, listening, learning. Shaq stood at the podium, adjusting the microphone. The audience fell silent. Then he spoke. A few months ago, I was told I didn't belong. Not for the first time, not for the last. But here's the thing. I never needed permission to belong. None of us do. The problem isn't that we don't belong. It's that some people have been told for so long that they own the space, they start to believe it. And when someone like me walks in, they panic. Not because I don't deserve to be there, but because they were never taught to see me as equal. I used to think people like that never changed. Maybe most don't, but maybe some do. And maybe that's what matters. Not punishing the past, but building a future where this doesn't happen again. Where no kid grows up being told they have to work twice as hard just to be seen as enough. Where no one walks into a room and is immediately questioned for being there. We're not asking for a seat at the table. We're building our own. The room erupted into applause. Shaq glanced at Victoria. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She just nodded. Maybe it was real growth. Maybe it wasn't. But in the end, that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was what came next. Real change doesn't happen by watching. It happens by acting. Shaq didn't just stand up for himself. He opened doors for others. Now, it's your turn. Support initiatives that break down barriers, uplift underrepresented voices, and create true opportunities. Because belonging isn't a privilege. It's a right. Join the movement. Build the future.